Yes, we'll do. Sorry, it's throwing up a bunch of pop-ups. Just a second.
Yep, no worries. Great,
Good.
great, great. Okay, the commissioner.
Ma'am. Well, everyone, it was so much fun last week doing the good work together. Here we are again. One more time, it's the great crew. I think it would be improved if we had an olfactory capacity so we could smell that cedar bark as we were doing our work. If you can work on that technology, somebody, that would be great. In the meantime, we'll have to depend on our words and our memories to capture the essence of what we're doing here, to honor the people and the land and everything that's part of it. I thank you for coming here, and I'm delighted to welcome you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Appreciate that. So we just felt like it was a lot last week. This is Kirsten Green. I'm the Deputy Director and the honor and responsibility of serving as the Tribal Liaison of the Department of Land Conservation and Development. Amanda Punton. Amanda, do you just want to introduce yourself for the record real quick?
Yes, Amanda Punton, Natural Resource Specialist for DLCD.
And we don't go anywhere without Amanda because she has drafted these rules and they are out in front of us. They've been out just a week ago last Thursday. So Amanda gave us a good overview at our last meeting on Thursday. Several of us on this call were there and a few others of us weren't able to make that and are coming in today. So today won't be a complete recap. We will provide a meeting summary, and certainly it's available on YouTube if you'd like to listen for 3 hours. But Amanda did a really good job, I thought, of kind of introducing the intent behind each part of the rule. We have a survey out and a questionnaire out for Rules Advisory Committee members to respond to kind of some specific questions for each sections. I know Cassie promised us detailed comments, but folks have until next Sunday. Ed already got his in, so thank you. But if anyone, would like to comment that way today, and we appreciate it because we'll be really reading your every word and having it as a part of the record, the background record. One of the things we wanted to do today as a priority, if we could, is hone in on some gaps in the rule. And those gaps are in 3 sections. Amanda, I'm not sure if you want to go ahead and pull up the draft rule today and share, that might be great because then you can drive as you would like.
Yeah.
I would go ahead and do the version in the meeting folder that's like, it's the version at RAC 3. So it had the notes I was taking on the screen at the RAC 3 meeting.
Okay, so not the one with my notes.
Right. I think your notes are probably ahead of the rest of us. So up to you.
Well, why don't I do that because it has things that I filled in already based on
comments. You see a work in progress from Amanda here, folks.
So, but I'm gonna have to close a few things first.
Okay. All right. And why don't we do quick intros just while we're getting organized here, because it's sometimes the only time I hear anyone's voice in the meeting, and I want to make sure at least to hear it at the beginning. I'm gonna go ahead and say some names if it's okay. We'll go in that order. So Jill, and then Christina, and then Kelly, and then Ed, Alyssa, Cassie, Curry, Jesse, Carrie, and Sarah, just on the order on the screen. Jill, would you go ahead and introduce yourself for the group, please?
Sure. So I'm Jill Rolfe. I'm the Coos County Community Development Director, and I also serve as the Planning Director for Coos County.
Thank you, ma'am. Director Rubido.
Luckily, Sod, Gawassissis, Christina Rubido. My name is Christina Rubido, and I'm the Culture and Heritage Director for the Klamath Tribes. Thank you, everyone, for being here.
Thank you, Christina. Try to nip on your heels there. Kelly.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Kelly Housley Glover. I'm the Wasco County Planning Director, and we implement the National Scenic Area in Wasco County.
Thank you, Kelly. Mr. Sullivan, Ed.
I'm Ed Sullivan. I'm a retired lawyer, and I've done a piece on the legal aspects of Goal 5.
Thank you. I feel so glad you're participating in this, and I can't resist but say, Dr. Bullion.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Alyssa Bullion, and I'm the state physical anthropologist with the Legislative Commission on Indian Services. And please just call me Alyssa.
Hi, no, I'm sorry. I like to show off your PhD when I can.
I appreciate that.
Cassie, please.
Thank you. Cassie Rippey. I am a tribal liaison and archaeologist with the Oregon Department of Transportation.
Thank you, ma'am. Curry.
Hi, everybody. I'm Curry Gill with Oregon Heritage, part of Parks and Recreation Department. It also includes the Oregon Heritage Commission and Oregon Commission on Historic Cemeteries.
Thank you, Curry. Your broad wingspan there. Thanks for making time again today. Jesse, please, if you want to come back and say hello once again. You don't have to come on camera if you don't mind.
Jess Beers Leaning, Shais the one Quat Quichin Heat, Shais one greetings everybody. My name is Jesse Beers. I'm cultural stewardship manager with Confederate Tribes, Akus, Quat, and Shais Indians. Isa, thank you.
Thank you, sir. Carrie.
Good afternoon. My name is Carrie Miller, and I serve the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation as their historic preservation officer and one of the archaeologists. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. And Sarah.
Good afternoon. I'm Sarah Palmer. I'm the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer for the Coquille Indian Tribe.
Thank you, Sarah. Appreciate it. Good. Okay. Well, let's just dive in. I want to thank Elliot and Adam, certainly for being here as well. Amanda, so this is our first question, and maybe we should just sort of back up one line, which might be on the previous page, because this is in section 5, is that right? So this is protection of significant archaeological sites, and Amanda did a good job last week reminding us that there's an inventory and then a protection. So it's sort of call and response in 2 areas. Inventory of archaeological sites and protection of archaeological sites. And we know that that world is already well regulated by statute and rule at SHPO and the Heritage Program at Parks and Recreation. And then there's inventory and protection of cultural areas, landscape figures of cultural significance. And that is the area that is sort of unwritten for the state in terms of Oregon land use rules. So those are new. But the part we were going to start with today is the portion on protection of significant archaeological sites. And we were talking about some of the parts we need to fill in are the thresholds. So Amanda, could you just ground us a little bit in A, and then we'll go into B?
Sure. So with A, this is the kind of lowest hanging fruit. It's using the local land use authorization process to provide information on existing state laws and rules pertaining to archaeological sites and disturbance of those sites and the requirement of a permit if sites are disturbed. And so the question here was, should this notice go out to everybody who's getting a land use permit, or some subset of that? And I think we heard 2 things. One, I think I didn't hear anybody suggest that it should be a subset, since it was an easy thing to do, just have it everywhere. And then Kelly, possibly it was you that said that not all permits are actually issued kind of physically. So if we wanted this information to get to everybody, it should be incorporated into the application materials, where someone would have to kind of check a box that they understand that these laws and permit requirements exist.
So generally, I think that's the tack we'll take here, unless there's a major objection. Obviously, for local governments, this would be part of the fiscal impact statement that our consultant will start to work on next week. So we're trying to get a draft of the rules over to that party, that third party, to evaluate for fiscal, housing, and racial equity impact. It's a state requirement of all rules in Oregon. So the idea was we'll get as much feedback as we can on this set of rules. We'll give it to the consultant. We'll continue to advance the rules a bit at the staff level concurrently. But then those set of impact statements would be available for the RAC to review at your July meeting. So that's why we're trying to fill in as many gaps as possible here. And so what Amanda just changed is that all applications would include this kind of checkbox, if you will, or acknowledgement of understanding. And that would be included in the fiscal impact statement analysis. Please, Jill.
Well, my only question is like, we require it for any new development that requires ground disturbing. So now I know we probably can be more restrictive, but I'm just curious how that works.
That issue has come up before. So what do you suggest? So we don't work at the counter, so
Right.
how
Well,
different are these applications, and how can we specify this for all jurisdictions so it makes sense?
I mean, it's a great question. I think that many counters probably take in many different types of site plans, so it's difficult. And I think that's why we generally said if it's any ground disturbing activity, then we require that notice to be sent out. But I don't know. And Cassie, maybe that's too much. Maybe we're sending too many notices. I don't know.
My personal opinion is that you can never have too many notices. But I think, and acknowledging that each jurisdiction is going to have a little bit of a different process for whether it's all applications or all applications involving ground disturbance. And it could, but realistically, like, I don't know. Does everybody have one application, or does for whether it's ground disturbing or not, or do some jurisdictions have an application that is not for things that don't involve ground disturbance? I think that
maybe I'll ask Kelly what you think, just because you also deal with.
And you guys, this one is informing the applicant, right? This isn't informing the tribe yet. This is just, yeah, good. Thank you.
So we
my fear is that we're not providing enough notice to the property owner, because I feel like any kind of ground disturbing, that they should be aware that there may be unanticipated discovery, or there may be requirements for notices. And I would much rather be upfront about that than like set some sort of square footage.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and it does look like, what we talked about at the last meeting was striking that, and it does look like we're suggesting that square footage is going to be stricken.
Right.
So
this would be all right. Yeah, good. Okay.
Well,
all right.
I did stick in the qualification that it's for ground disturbing activities. So like a change of use of an existing building wouldn't require.
Right.
Are you going to define ground disturbance, what we mean in this section? Because I think that might be important.
I think that could certainly be a helpful additional definition.
Well, if we're going to describe it as everything, do we need to describe it, right? I mean, is it a post hole, or is it then we get back to a minimum square footage, but we don't even know. Or are you saying that grading versus vegetation removal, or just use the word grading?
No, I think ground disturbance is the right language. I think we can, I think there's probably a definition that exists in the SHPO world somewhere for this. I know we've pulled one before.
Sarah has her hand up, please, Sarah.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like ground disturbance is pretty plain language, to be honest. I feel like the advantage of using that language is that it's in common use and it's not hard to understand. I think the issue is more frequently that people would prefer not to understand it than that it is a complex thing to understand. People say, well, what do you mean ground disturbance? And I say, I mean ground disturbance. And they say, do you mean if I dig a hole? And I say, yes. I mean, if you dig a hole. Well, what if I put a core sample in? Yes, that's also ground disturbance. But in general, I find that that's, you might have a definition, but it honestly, it almost defines itself. It's really straightforward. And so I think that trying to put square footage on there, you're honestly making it more confusing, I think, when you do that, because you're suggesting that there are ground disturbing actions that aren't ground disturbing actions, and that's a bit circular.
Yeah, why don't we try it without for now? And certainly we have a long, you guys, just as a reminder, the final on this is really probably the end of public comment, and which includes Sovereign's comment. So forgive me, it would be the end of all comment on October, around mid-October, as we prepare the rule for the final hearing in early December. So we have some months yet to look at a fresh rule, to think about it again, but it's Kelly, if you can live, or I think it was Kelly, if you asked if we should define ground disturbance, but hearing hey, if it's plain language, let's not try and describe it, or we might get ourselves wrapped around the axle. Kelly, how do you feel about that?
I just am trying to anticipate feedback that I've heard before about the term ground disturbance.
Right, you've heard it, yeah.
Yeah, and people are in particular in rural jurisdictions that have a lot of agricultural activity, particularly concerned about impacts to agricultural activity.
Got
So
you.
I have some sensitivities around that.
That's good. Thank you, Kelly. Yeah.
And so, although when we write this rule, it shouldn't be too hard to understand the words that we're using, people will have to understand where it fits within the regulatory structure. Because if we tried to explain that all the time, I think people will get lost as to what the rule is trying to do. So local jurisdictions don't have authority to regulate agricultural activities. So this rule is not doing that. Although, I mean, it does, local jurisdictions do regulate or would issue a permit to a structure being built on agricultural land. But that's the way it's been for a long time. So hopefully, yeah, people can see it within the context of how this rule speaks to local governments and what our authorities at DLCD are.
But Kelly, it's a good point, and I take Sarah's too, which is people just want it kind of explained, and that could be in guidance. So I've just started a frequently asked questions sheet, and that could be one of them. What is ground disturbance? It doesn't have to all go in the rule. You know, I think it's nice to have a compendium that is how to use the rule, what's the intent of the rule, and we just had our first frequently asked questions, Kelly. So thank you. What is ground disturbance? And I'm sure we'll have many, many more. But good. Okay. Why don't we move forward gently but steadily into B, if A looks okay, knowing that we would take up the definition of ground disturbance and associate guidance for now, that being the path. Amanda?
So here, I'll just say, gone back and forth a little bit of how to write this, and this is where we settled, or I settled for the first draft to bring to the rack. Because there's a lot of quasi-judicial applications that involve quasi-judicial review can involve a lot of different things. So in the conversation, I just left it. So quasi-judicial review in the bracket saying describe a threshold by size or type of development. You know, so whether we catch here, again, ground disturbing stuff, or whether we are talking about commercial activity versus residential development, or whether we're talking about development of a certain footprint. And this here, we are now saying that a local government will need to notify a tribe or tribes, and we'll have some way of figuring out which ones that each city or county would be communicating with. This 25 days in brackets is to try to glom on a few more days of to the 120-day review period. I guess it's 120, or what's the other review period?
150.
50. So try to get a few more days than that by having this information, but the jurisdiction sends it out after they receive the application, and it's during that 30-day period where they get to they determine whether the application is complete. So got a period of time where something is coming in, applicants coming in saying they want to do something, and it's a something that will require a public process, and to which subjective standards can be applied, unless we're talking about housing. And so that's the question. So for what kind of those applications should cities and counties be required to notify tribes and say, hey, we have this application, let us know if you're concerned?
Cassie has her hand up. Thanks, Cassie. Go ahead.
Yes, so here again, this is where I would, once again recommend for applications involving ground disturbing activity. I think that really gets to the crux of the issue there.
Be consistent there. And Kelly, you have also a raised hand.
Yeah, thank you. So I have a couple questions. One, I'm assuming that on the federally recognized tribal list, that includes Washington tribes as well.
It's not for Oregon. So this is why I'm so glad Alyssa is here. So when we say federally recognized tribes in Oregon, we mean the 9.
Okay.
So it's very different from your context in Big Gorge.
And I would have concerns about that because how folks traveled historically in and around our region would we have evidence of sort of Yakima, for instance, or Nez Perce, all the way past the scenic area. So that's one comment I wanted to make. But the other, I guess it's more of a question. If I do the thought experiment and I think about all ground disturbance, which is typically quasi-judicial, is going to be everything that we do in quasi-judicial with maybe 1 or 2 exceptions. You think about the scale of that from every jurisdiction in the state of Oregon. I'm concerned that the tribes capacity to really address every single application within a 25-day standard. So I think ground disturbance, I would agree that makes the most sense, but I think from a scale approach, it's pretty concerning. And I don't have a solution to offer. I just wanted to throw that out there.
Sure. Sure. And we heard, right. Yep. So I think Kelly, I appreciate that. And from what I'm hearing too, you're saying, is it too much on the tribe side? So I think we just hold that question and say, let's let the tribes respond. Obviously, it would be very individual. And I hear you. Jill also has her hand up and Alyssa has her hand up. Thanks, Kelly.
So I will tell you one thing that we have struggled with is not having a complete application. So if you want to send it when it first comes, if you don't have a complete application and we say, hey, you don't have a complete application, and they substantially change it, then the tribes are not privy to that substantial change. So I am a little bit concerned about sending it within that deemed complete timeframe, just because it's likely going to substantially change.
So the area, though, where it's located, is that likely to change?
I don't know that it's the area, but it is where the ground disturbing is going to happen. And a lot of times, when evaluating, you're looking at where the ground disturbing is going to happen to where the site is or where the potential site is to be able to provide those accurate comments.
And so, but could that, let's say it's a 5-acre site and a tribe is aware of archaeological site somewhere even near there. And that might even be enough just to raise the concern and then have the conversation later. And I'm only asking that because, this was kind of a creative idea to get more time. But if we don't use this creative idea to get more time, then we're back to everything happening within the 120 or 150 day window.
Oh, I see. I mean, they definitely can send comments and say it's near a site. I mean, we have had that happen and we've tried to put parameters to address that. I just was a little bit concerned that what happens when it substantially changes and what is that flag to say we need to resend notice. Or, maybe something didn't get caught.
Okay,
So just a thought.
yeah.
No, that makes sense, Jill. Thank you for contributing that expertise. As much as I meant to go be at the counter for my first job out of graduate school, I haven't. So we're really grateful for you and Kelly and the local governments serving here to help us understand what's workable and realistic and functional. Okay, so maybe, so I guess we're landing that. I know, Alyssa, your hand is up, and I think, Alyssa, if I'm mind reading it, might be to think that you're coming in to comment on the notion of the Washington State tribes, is that right? Or did you want to comment on this part too?
Yeah, it was going to be in response to kind of talking about tribes beyond the 9 federally recognized of Oregon, so we can circle back to that if there were other things that.
Perfect, thank you. If we could hold, and then Carrie, do you have a thought here on this kind of the notice aspect of B? And if not, we'll loop back to the notification of tribes in Washington too.
I was more on the time frame discussion. So
Let's do it. Yeah, please go ahead, Carrie. Yeah.
I think it's more just an awareness. We often, at least at the Umatilla, encourage the electronic transmittal. I realize everybody doesn't have that opportunity. But just note that when we're still doing paper mailings, that time frame can really be diminished very quickly, where say the land use, they're sending it out, but maybe it doesn't go out of the mailroom for a few days, and then it's going to go to our board of trustees, and then someone's going to process the mail, and it really might take like 10 days before it actually gets to the cultural resource people that need to look at it. So don't have an answer and but just knowing to that can really be diminished. So whether it would be 30 days, because that really might be 20 days for a paper mailing, but anyways, food for thought.
Thank you. Amanda, was there a reason you landed on the 25? So like there was.
It was just to give time. I mean, it's 30 days, and I guess figuring that a local government would need a few days to turn around getting the application and just getting a notice out the door. So this is pretty quick still.
And a local government side. Thank you. So local government, maybe, and Amanda, you or Kelly and Jill can help me, but a local government must deem complete or not within 30 days. Is that right? Yeah.
Yeah, I was thinking about this a little bit more, and maybe Amanda, you're onto something. Like in 25 days, if somebody sends us a comment back and says this is insufficient for me to provide a comment, would that be a way for us to deem an application incomplete until the additional information has been submitted?
Well, I think, wouldn't the completeness of an application be written into your code?
It is, but I mean, if you felt like that was a discretionary that like we could include, like you could put in a guide somewhere that says, if you write this into your code for completeness, that would give us that additional time.
Yeah, I think I'm just soaking in the different ideas you have right now, but I guess if I was to respond, I would say that it might be challenging from the applicant's point of view to have, like, if it's the local government deciding that the application is complete or not, that's fine. But if it was the tribe deciding whether the application was complete or not, that might be not, I'm not sure how well that would work.
I guess we would have to write in what was the expectation from the applicant to provide to the tribe, and then that would help us say whether they've met those obligations or not.
And if we went down to a few more lines here, sections here, what we're getting to is once something's flagged, then there's a conversation during the public hearing process as to what kind of mitigation there could be to hopefully avoid impacts. And I guess I'm kind of thinking that the absolute detail of what's happening in what's prescribed in the application is maybe less important, because there will be time to talk about that and try to, and look at avoidance measures, even if the original application wasn't precise, because then they'll switch, right? Maybe they'll decide, okay, we'll put the, I don't know, we'll put the building over here rather than here because we don't want to dig a basement over, in the area of concern.
Okay, that's fair.
Great, Sarah, on this point, I have a feeling you're coming in on this point, rather than notice of Washington tribes, and we'll come back to that for sure, Alyssa. Thank you. I don't want your hand to lose blood in it, Alyssa, but go ahead and keep up your electronic hand there, so remember to come back. Thank you so much. Sarah, please.
Yes, that's correct. The Coquille tribe does not have a position on the notification of Washington tribes, and I don't think that my personal take is necessary at this moment.
Yeah.
I want to kind of speak to a couple of what I would call conceptual misunderstandings that I'm hearing for when we are doing these reviews. I think there is an assumption being made that when we are doing a review at the tribal level, that we are aware of an existing site that has clearly defined boundaries and that it would be possible to move things around within a given tax lot to avoid those. Often that is that's not really the best way to think about what we might know. What we would know would be more like what the overall sensitivity is. But on most private property, there won't have been any cultural resources survey. And so in general, what we're going to be asking for out of our office is I can tell you when there's going to be a situation where I think that it would be in the project proponent's best interests to get someone in to do a survey because they're in a high risk environment. But realistically, that is the kind of information that in most cases, I am going to be able to provide either a local government or a project proponent. And so I think as you talk about these timelines, I would encourage you to think about it more in that way and in terms of what risks you're prepared to accept for yourself and for these members of the public, rather than imagining that tribes have this knowledge base that is not necessarily present. I think there may be a bit of an overestimation. There are certainly cases where we have a pretty good idea where things are, and there are other cases where what I can say to you is, you're in a high-risk environment now, and here's what I would recommend to you. I also want to be clear that, at least out of our office, our consultative relationship is with the local government. It is not necessarily with the project proponent, and this is something that we have to go over with people quite a bit. Where are those relationships? Those relationships are at the intergovernmental level. And so I've heard some talk about having tribes maybe determine that applications are complete or incomplete. Again, what I can do from where I sit is I can function in an advisory role. And I can tell you, if I were you, I would want this additional information. But it would not be within our sphere of authority to approve or disapprove any kind of a permit or an application that's being issued by another government entity. And I want to be really clear that that is not something, at least that we are requesting. That is not within my sphere of authority. So I hope that kind of helps clarify a couple of these matters, at least from where I sit, as far as what we can and can't take on and the level of advice that we can and can't give. Thank you.
So that's really helpful. And I just highlighted kind of the so what part of if a tribe said, yeah, we think there's a concern. And it's worded right now that it was just that the tribe would get back and say that the proposed action or development has potential to impact a site of archaeological significance. So it's not saying definitively. And then when that happens, then the local government during the public process is responsible for exploring and employing appropriate measures for avoiding or minimizing impacts to the site. And I'll say it now because it's very strongly related to this, is that if this rule is not really trying to add any new regulation for archaeological sites, then maybe what this rule is about avoiding. And then if there are any impacts at all, then that's when the requirements for state permits would kick in. So what you're suggesting as, you know, your reply would be if it were you, or what you recommend is that they have a survey because it's a high risk area, that would be perfect kind of information that could then be explored more during the public process, and they come out the other end and either the applicant is like, thank you so much for letting us know, because we wouldn't want to stumble into an inadvertent discovery without being prepared. Or maybe they say, I don't know, yeah, whatever, thanks, bye, see ya. But then they're also at higher notice when or if impact to a site occurs.
So the hesitation that I would have a little bit as I look at D here is that you assume that there is a known site. And on private property, the reality is in most of the state of Oregon, on private property, you are not going to be dealing with a known site.
Okay.
And I feel like it's kind of a lawyer question how to structure this a little bit differently. This is a little bit past me, but this language here in these clauses assumes that you're dealing with a known site. Oh, good. And we have a lawyer who's raised his hand. So maybe Mr. Sullivan will have some input here, but often I can't tell you for sure you're in a site. I can look at your building lot and go, oh boy, I bet you'd hit something there. But without inspecting it, without more knowledge, I am not going to be able to tell you that. And this doesn't kick in. It doesn't look to me like this kicks in until you're in a category where you know you've got a site, and that's almost never going to be where we are.
And then Ed, thoughts, please?
Yeah, two things. So one, maybe good news and the rest problematic. I'm a lawyer after all. So the good news is that you don't have to really worry about the 120, 150 day problem because that only applies when the action is wholly within the control of the local governing body, authority and control. So ideally, you could say, no, this is outside the control. It belongs to the state or the sovereign tribe. The bad part about it, I think, is what Sarah just raised, and that is, how the hell do you know when to give that notice? Certainly for something that's on the aura, that's fine. Arguably, if it's within a site that a tribe has written about to the local government, that could be covered. But as Sarah said, what happens when, for the majority of the sites, even on private lands, it's not designated anywhere? Who makes that determination? Is it the planning director? Is it anybody else other than the individual making the application? And what does happen if the application is made and there is no notice? When can that be raised? Maybe during the hearing, certainly with the case out of Deschutes County last week, that can be done. But what happens otherwise? And the problem here to me is that you don't have a situs, which is previously designated in a plan or in a land use document to raise this issue. So how do you get to the adequacy of notice and the problem if notice is not given? I'm trying largely to be quiet on these things, but these are questions that I think we need to deal with.
Definitely, Ed, thank you. Just to roll back for a second, because I think we did kind of agree by lack of argument to the contrary that in B, it would be for all ground disturbing activity. So notice would be provided for all ground disturbing activity. And then it would just be what if a tribe does or doesn't comment, I think is what we're wrestling with here. But I think we've established that for the time being, we've said that notice would be given for all ground disturbing activities for archaeological sites. No, Amanda, correct me, yeah.
We're on to quasi judicial decisions. There's been talk about actually using some kind of threshold because otherwise it would be could inundate tribes, could be too much work for local governments. But this
I heard the inundation of tribes. I didn't hear a too much work for local government. So I think if you don't mind just scrolling back up a little bit to B, I just want to make sure we've solved that gap there. So B, we've said just, describe a threshold by size or type of development. Cassie made the suggestion that would be all again in this case. Kelly said that might be too much on tribes, but I didn't hear folks say it would be too much for the local government. So right now, I think on B, we have a proposal that would be for all ground disturbing activities again, unless I'm mistaken.
For all quasi judicial applications, which we've heard will almost always be a ground disturbing, have ground disturbing elements to it.
Right. Jill, you had your hand up in this section, and then John.
Yeah, I kind of have a feeling this is probably based off of our comprehensive plan language.
As if your ears are burning last Thursday, yeah.
So we, in 2002, we worked with the tribes to identify areas that were significant, not actual sites. And that's what our notice is based off of. So we didn't say that, hey, this is a site point. Actually, we did two different maps. We said, here are the sites that we know of. And then here's the likely sites. And so we have a broad range of area that's already identified that is a likely area that you're going to find these types of resources. I think that would be a huge mapping job for somebody.
Right, you guys did it, but most places don't have that. It's true. Yeah.
Yes. So I think that using our language without those maps available may be causing some of that question that comes up to answer Mr. Sullivan. So we have that agreement that says, hey, we look at the map. If it's in this area, then we provide that notice. If it's not within that area, and when I say area, they're blocks. They're not like, points on a map. It's whole areas. So, and then we also look if it's in certain areas, tells us which tribes to provide that notice to.
Thank you, John.
Yeah, I have some comments. So I agree with the all ground disturbance and all that, but I would just say that, consider they're putting in a new freeway near Thomas Jefferson's house, Monticello, and they build an off-ramp that stops at his front door. It's not touching his front door, but that would be considered, a problem, an adverse effect. And the same can happen for archaeological sites, especially ones that have been evaluated through Section 106, because there are federal undertakings that still happen in these areas. And if you had an archaeological site that, for example, there was some sort of line of sight that was really important from the site, you could actually see a storied or legendary landscape or something like that. Avoiding that site may not be what's going to address adverse effects, but if you're obstructing that line of sight, that could be a problem. So I provided my comments on this earlier today, but that was just one of them. So it's fresh. And then I also just wanted to apologize for starting late. I had a little bit of a conflict with meetings.
No, John, thanks for joining in today, and hold that thought, John, for the landscape features of cultural significance section, because we're still just in the archaeological inventory and protection section, but thank you, John. So I'm still hearing, concern, of course, the whole rule is fraught with concern, but if it, a proposal that B would be for all applications, all ground disturbing applications requiring quasi-judicial review, a local government shall notice. So that's what I'm hearing, Amanda. Are you hearing what I'm hearing?
I guess I'd like to ask for everybody on the call, from whatever their perspective is with this, whether we have, what do we have, 300 and something jurisdictions in the state?
270 some.
270, and all quasi judicial reviews. I mean, I don't know what that number is, but it's going to be high. And just from the perspective of, well, and also we have cities of all different kinds of sizes and staffing. So from both the local jurisdiction perspective and from a tribe's perspective who's receiving notices, is there any, but just more, I'd like to hear more comment on a threshold of size versus no threshold of size.
Are there any further comments? Because I'm hearing a lack of objection as like go forward. So does anyone particularly want to voice concern? Now remember, we will be doing impact analysis on this if that's what it says. So we'd be uncovering that impact to local government for, you know, further public comment. But at this stage, does anyone want to say, hey, we should take another tack? Okay, Ed.
You're on mute, sir.
I don't think you should use size at all. There are always going to be things that fall under that. And I think having maybe the type of action or something else like that. It seems to me if you're looking at quasi-judicial, most of these fall into the category of permits. So you could say all permits have to have that. The one additional one you might want to do is building permits. Again, it depends on what the situs is. Where do you start from? Where is the area in which you're going to make the inquiry? Is it a particular site or is it an area in a block? But it seems to me that you should not use thresholds with areas.
Thank you, Ed. This is what I've been kind of hearing to date in the meeting and not seeing any other hands up, but thank you, Ed. I saw you provided that in your comment as well. Okay, so then let's take a break and hear from Alyssa, and then we'll maybe come back to D. Thanks, Alyssa, for your patience.
Yeah, no worry. So yeah, just to kind of circle back to the question of consultation with appropriate tribes. So in the state of Oregon, the Legislative Commission on Indian Services has been statutorily given the responsibility to kind of be the body that advises Oregon officials and agencies on which tribes need to be consulted with, and within that, it is our policy that is what we're referring to when we say appropriate tribes is limited to the 9 federally recognized tribes of Oregon. So that's our capacity. That is not us, denying the history of other tribes who are not federally recognized within Oregon, the significance, and we do have, bodies and organizations that include non-Oregon federally recognized tribes working and collaborating in Oregon. I'm thinking especially of things like Critfee, Wanabakut along the Columbia. Certainly we acknowledge that, but just in terms of the way that our current consultation policies function, that is the capacity of LCIS, and we are the body that is designated to be the ones who designate those tribes. It's the question of local governments now, because again, mostly we're dealing with state agencies. I do work with local governments when they have questions. And again, I focus my recommendations on the 9 federally recognized tribes of Oregon. I do know there have been different cities that have, for specific projects, spoken with and consulted with non-federally recognized, non-Oregon federally recognized tribes. And to my knowledge, we do not have a specific policy beyond, again, our current general state policy of LCIS recommending tribes from our 9 federally recognized tribes of Oregon. There is a consultation task force that's supposed to be being convened. I don't know how that would or would not impact some of these questions. And again, our kind of statutory authorities are kind of primarily focused on the state agencies. So that has been our policy within LCIS. So that's kind of what I'm going to limit my comments to in terms of this and my understanding of what the statewide policy has been. So yeah, I'm happy to try and answer any kind of follow-up questions on that, but yeah, I just mostly want to focus on what our current policy has been.
Alyssa, thank you. And Kelly, I'm just thinking here, you know, to say flippantly, well, the Columbia River Gorge communities could go beyond what we're requiring here is pretty flippant, I feel like, but maybe we could at least recognize that in the impact statement. You know, Kelly, that you have existing obligations and relationships with tribes on both sides of the river, obviously the river being a uniting, not a dividing cultural element. Would that be a way to get at it, Kelly, is to recognize the Columbia River Gorge responsibilities for notice so that we're not silent on it? What do you think?
I don't have a ready answer for you. I think it's worth conversation just because where we are situated here in the Dalles, it was a cultural site for not just tribes like within an immediate area, but sort of lots of tribes all over the place. And I think even the 5 treaty tribes that we regularly work with are sort of limited. So I think acknowledging it, yeah, probably would be helpful. And then I know we have the ability to be more restrictive or to add on to state law, and that may be a conversation that we have locally.
Right. Thank you for raising it, though. I appreciate that. And we were really glad to see when you applied to be on this committee for those reasons. So thank you. Carrie.
And if we go with the idea of having some kind of impact statement, I just think it might be best to keep it broad while the Columbia River tribes are important. And thank you, Kelly, for bringing that up, because we're all sort of interrelated and recognize our neighbors. There are other communities that have established these relationships with other tribes. So like Wallowa County, or, you know, they are constantly sending notices out to the Nimi, to the Nez Perce tribe. Right. And so there's some communities that have these relationships. And so just be wary like of how might phrase that, or, you know, down by the California border, maybe some of those towns, I don't know them all. So it may not just be as simple as making one statement, or maybe a broad statement about local communities, you know, may have established relationships with other, you know, federally recognized tribes from other states, or however we would like to phrase it. But it's greater than the Columbia River Gorge, and just so we can all be aware of that as we move forward. Thanks for bringing that up, Kelly.
Alyssa, please.
Yeah, just to kind of echo what Carrie was saying, and just in terms of the keeping that broadness, just because I would just also say that we want to be careful that we're not inadvertently establishing a different consultation precedent that hasn't gone through full consultation with the tribes and other appropriate bodies. So I just, you know, want to be careful that we're not setting up any conflicts with other agencies or government processes. So again, just that call to, if there was going to be a nod to that, keeping it as a more general statement, not as like this is the consultation, you know, policy of Oregon, because that I don't think, personally, it doesn't seem like that would be the role of this body.
Right, for sure. We don't want to exclude that. It's not the intent here to exclude comment by other tribes. I think that's our goal, is that those would still be welcome, but minimum notice requirements here is, I think, what we're talking about is the minimum, not to exclude, not to set a universe. Yeah. Good. Thank you, Alyssa. Good. Okay. And then back to D. gone broad, and rightly so.
Can I ask that on B,
please.
Should I strike type of development too? So it's just all quasi judicial review? We're not gonna qualify at all?
You know, and that's what Ed had said in his comments, isn't it? Ed, you had kind of said all quasi judicial. Yeah. Yeah, and Ed's written comments. So if there's any objection, let us know now. But I think that that's the broader way to go. It's not only ground disturbing, it would just be quasi judicial land use actions. Okay. I'm broad here, starting broad. So, okay, thank you. Anything else on D, Amanda?
So D, Sarah was making the point about, what's kind of known and not known at the time that a tribe receives notice. And I think the word potential is very broad. For now, I changed this to not be mentioning sites of significance, although our rule is really only protecting sites of significance, but the significance of the site won't be figured out till sometime later. So what I did here, I still just, for now, change this to when information is entered into the record for a decision that the proposed action or development has potential to impact an archaeological site, the local government must explore and employ appropriate measures for characterizing, right? Because then we're going to know more about the site, or the idea that maybe what the recommendation is to have a survey. So employ appropriate measures for characterizing and avoiding or minimizing. I'm asking myself a question now about whether this should just be avoiding, or if there's ways to minimize below when a permit, a SHPO permit is needed. So I would like to hear about that. So that's where we are right with this before I go into the list.
There are a couple of hands. Sorry, I didn't see the order, you guys. Could we hear from Cassie, then John, then Kelly?
Actually, could John go first? Because I feel like he might be saying what I was going to.
You bet. Yeah. John.
Oops. Maybe he left.
You're muted.
Sorry about that. I was muted. I've been on Teams all day, so going to Zoom is difficult for me.
Sorry about that.
Yeah.
So I have two thoughts. So first of all, our statute says that, thou shalt not excavate, injure, alter, or destroy an archaeological site or remove an archaeological object without first obtaining a permit from SHPO. There's nothing in the statute that says it has to be a site of archaeological significance or not, eligible to the National Register or not. You just can't do that without a permit. So that's the first point that I wanted to bring up. The second point that I think that this is kind of interesting, and I hadn't thought of it until now. So it wasn't in my earlier comments that I submitted, but so the statute defines site of archaeological significance, which means it is eligible for or listed on the National Register. But it's thinking of all these as individual archaeological sites. And the interesting thing about the National Register is sometimes a property may not be eligible or significant on its own, but it might be eligible or significant as part of a district, which means you have to look at the context of where it is. Maybe there's other archaeological sites in the area, and you have for example, criterion A in the National Register would be a pattern of events. So maybe you'd have something like that. So I'm going to think about this a little bit more as far as comments, but I'm not trying to, I'm always trying to make this sound like Section 106 when I can, because that's more process, and this we're limited a little bit, but that is a way that a group of archaeological sites could be determined eligible or listed on the National Register if they're looked at in that district context. And I think that then would make a group of them each sites of archaeological significance or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
And so while you were talking, John, I was reminded of the word alteration. So just stuck this in here, see what people think. So I scratch the word minimizing and just have now avoiding alteration, because that would be the threshold at which a permit is needed.
Yeah,
That's-
for the permit, excavate, injure, alter, or destroy. Yeah, that's all the threshold. So yeah, I think that it's better to use that language if we can from statute.
So alteration doesn't include those things?
I think, let's see, I've got two rack members from our permit rule revision. I think we defined alteration in our rule. And I think we also defined destroy and excavate, if I'm not mistaken. So we did define all those, but they're each differently called out in the statute.
Okay.
We'll probably have to list them all then, you guys, yeah, or cross-reference to the rule. Cassie.
Yeah, thank you. So John got to part of my comment. So thank you, John, very much. I think that yes, it is important to make it say the potential to impact an archaeological site, because a significance is not always known at this stage, and doing so could create some miscommunication and misunderstanding there. So I think that's important to make that edit. I disagree about removing the word minimizing, because by saying to employ measures for avoiding, characterizing and avoiding, and only leaving avoiding as the option, means that this is going to sound like the only way you're going to approve a permit, these applications, is if you can avoid the site, and that's not always necessary or appropriate. And so I think it would be better to say characterizing and avoiding or minimizing alterations to the site. I just don't want to create that restriction.
Right. Yeah. So this rule doesn't say that right now. What it says is that once you've gone through had this conversation, then what the city or county is responsible for doing is including in their decision findings on measures considered and measured employed to protect the site. And I've got the same language here: avoiding or mitigating impacts. That must be described, but that's not saying anything is necessarily done, and it could easily be a handoff to an archaeological permit from SHPO.
Yeah, I'm just going to reiterate that avoiding and mitigating are two different actions, and avoiding and minimizing and mitigating are three different actions. So I think it's important to really clearly state that minimizing is also an option.
So here, this is what I was wondering. So let's say it's minimized, something's still happening. Is a permit from SHPO required?
Yeah, if you're doing any ground disturbing activity within an archaeological site, a permit is required.
Okay, so once we cross the line into the SHPO permit, then the SHPO permit controls, and the local government action, the local government authority doesn't. The local government authority here, but we're saying that they have to do, is to do everything that leads up to the point of advising that that the survey should be done because you might need a permit, or maybe you have enough information so you know there's a permit. But the local government, I guess what I got concerned about is that you wouldn't want the local government saying, yeah, you've minimized, you're good to go, without involving a state permit.
Yeah, so I think then that, can you scroll back up to that sentence? If that's the intent is to say, get it to a point where you're talking about your permit, say that in there, because this doesn't talk about getting a permit. And I'll have to look at it and think on it some more. And when I submit my comments, I'll try to submit some specific language about it. But this doesn't say anything about getting it to a point where you can then get a permit and then do whatever. This just says you're going to avoid it or not.
Amanda, if you don't mind just putting a comment in here in D that just says that we really do, need to tie it to the handoff to SHPO's rules here for a permit. In D, I can make a note of my own, but Cassie, I take your point for sure.
We do need to be clear, that nothing in this rule diminishes in any way the requirements for archaeological permits, right? It can't do any of that. So, and maybe that's something that goes up front rather than here, but I will put a note.
Thank you. Thank you. I think just so it's a clear read that it's a jumping off point. to permit. Yeah. Kelly?
Thanks. I think I'm sort of riffing off of some of the points that Cassie raised, which is I have concerns about the language the local government must explore and employ. And I think this was raised last Thursday, that we need to rethink that language, because sort of the way my concern about the read of that language is that it's tantamount to an unfunded mandate that we're going to have to go, and local government is going to have to go and make the determination of boundary sites, which we don't have access to aura. So, and we're not skilled archaeologists, so we don't have the ability to do that. And that the other things in A through G, the local government's going to be on the hook for. And what I'm hearing from the cultural experts is that actually there's the language should be pointing to the local government basically being the go-between to help an applicant figure out when a SHPO permit is needed. So I think local government must explore and employ is really, really problematic.
Right.
And
right, Kelly, I do see my note here. If it's helpful, I could, what my pen said, we said on Thursday is that we facilitate, but developers should explore. So local government facilitates, but developers should explore those then actions. That I don't, Amanda and I haven't had a chance to kind of get together on edits. Jill, do you have an opinion here on this one?
I do. I would agree with Kelly and with Cassie. I mean, if the point of this is to get to a SHPO permit, then we need to be upfront about that. I mean, this is kind of like losing you in the weeds before you actually have that understanding.
Right.
And it's very confusing. And so I think that there's a lot of words maybe that you don't even have to use in here if the idea is that we send for comments, and if the comments come back that there's a potential for harm to a cultural resource site or area, or it's unidentified, that either a survey needs to be done or a SHPO permit needs to be obtained.
Thanks.
We also have in addition to not putting too much burden on local governments and not putting too much burden on tribes, we can't put too much burden on SHPO. And then the other thing I wanted to say is our rule can't require something of an applicant. It can require that a city or county require something of an applicant, but we don't speak to the applicant directly. And I'm just saying those things not to like have an answer or solution to the problem that is in here right now, but the things that we need to think about and trying to solve this problem.
Well, I guess then why do we have requiring an inadvertent discovery plan, paving oversight? I mean, those are kind of things that you have in there. So maybe there's just a better way to word it. Maybe it just seems a little bit confusing. Yeah. And well, I know what you did. You took a local government's wording and you brought it in, and I think that's why it's maybe clunky.
Mm-hmm. Right. So, but the local government is still figuring out these measures, which they can require certain things of the applicant in order to get to be able to make these decisions. But are you also saying, Jill, that this list is the wrong list to use here? The A through G?
I kind of think maybe if you want the local government to put in the list, that you wouldn't put it in the rule, you would direct the local government to make the list. Right.
We can't, I don't know, because there's so many we can't, right now we entered this rulemaking with that we'd come out with some improvement at the end, but not actually requiring a plan amendment on the part of a local government.
Oh.
So we'd have something that applies directly. And then they have the option of developing a plan amendment and doing things way better than what we're trying to describe here, but something's described here that applies directly.
That's a tough one, Amanda. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
How to get you there.
Kind of like the aggregate rule, right?
Right. But I do agree with what has been said in the past. It just seems like if really we're trying to get to a place where we can determine whether a SHPO permit is actually required or not required. Maybe that's a better word for it. The language doesn't quite work, and I'm just not sure how to get you there.
Yeah, and
I suggest the word requiring, and it, like, for example, requiring an inadvertent discovery plan. That makes more sense to me than some of the other things in that list, because you're asking local government to make that requirement of the applicant. Whereas determining the boundary of the site, paving over the site, this is really semantics. I recognize this, but this is the kind of stuff that we get challenged on. So if it was requiring paving over a site without the disturbance, requiring clustering development, that may get us there, Amanda. I'm not sure, but a sort of a way to think about it is the word that's operationalizing what you're asking it to do needs to be think about local government as the facilitator, local government as the regulatory body, and not the actual actor. And I think that's sort of what's tripping me up anyway about the list that you've enumerated here.
so local governments must explore and employ appropriate measures for the applicant to employ. Is that what's missing?
The local government must explore and condition appropriate measures.
Condition the application okay.
Yeah, conditioning the
I don't
whatever.
understand the term explore as it's used here. It related to my role as a regulatory body. So local government shall condition appropriate measures, sure, but exploration I think is problematic from my perspective. But then it's also, as you get into the list, thinking about it more of as a requirement rather than I don't know.
So I think this goes back to what Sarah was saying, right? Sarah's the tribe's relationship is with the local government and not necessarily with the applicant. And Sarah, certainly feel free to jump in and correct me or add anything else in. But here I'm saying, you know, this is the opportunity where if there is some issue, the tribe can consult with the local government on issues and things that they think is appropriate to be included with.
And maybe that's the word, it's consult, not explore.
Yeah. That might be fair.
Yeah, I think if that's the intent, you need to be very, very explicit.
I will just throw in that the the international standard on this is not consultation, it's consent. As we're exploring verbs, I don't expect any of you to agree to that, but I'm going to keep sitting here and pointing out that is the international standard, is consent, not consultation.
Thank you, Sarah.
And consultation, at least the way we understand it here at the LCD, is many layered, kind of repeated inquiry, some back and forth, and it goes to the tribal council, not to tribal staff, and all of that. I'm hesitant to use the word consultation here when we're talking about Fossil, Oregon, needing to work their way through this rule.
You mean insert any name of any small
Yeah.
local government, yeah.
And at Fossil in particular, they don't even have staff, right? Their staff duties are assigned to whoever, their planning commission at the time. Or many cities who only have city recorders is the only staff that they have in their planning office.
I guess my whole issue is when you say the government must explore and employ appropriate measures, that's a discretionary decision. That's going to get appealed.
Well, these are discretionary. These are official.
But I thought that you were just saying that the point is to get it to where we say we're going to require a SHPO permit, which is different because that's not really discretionary. There's actual rules that apply when a SHPO permit is required versus
Yeah.
How about
it's not.
consider?
So
How
I
about-
guess I'm confused. Maybe I got lost.
How about, and we certainly we can all submit written comments with wordsmithing, but you could say must consider and condition. You know, if they're considering things that are coming in through consultation and coordination with the tribes, and with the applicant and with SHPO, so they're considering all of those things are coming through.
That would make more sense to me.
Yeah, so I would say condition and, or consider and condition.
So considering what?
And condition rather than employ, because they're not the ones that are actually doing the implementation.
I got it, yeah. So I put conditions afterwards, see if that works. And I want to I didn't mean, I don't think, to say that we're asking local government to decide when a SHPO permit is needed. I think what I was trying to say is that this rule is trying not to so it's not trying to add any requirements for protecting archaeological sites. This rule is trying to inform people of those rules and flag situations where one of those permits might be needed. And then if we get I don't know, 50% better awareness and compliance with those rules and those SHPO permit requirements, then we're making success. And I've made this analogy, before and on Thursday, that when in the wetland notification, so in the wetland land use notification that goes to DSL when a development is proposed in the vicinity of a wetland on the state wetland inventory, the information that comes back isn't you must get a permit from DSL. They don't come back and say you must. They might say we highly advise, or we highly advise you get a delineation, and then they'll determine whether a permit is needed. And if we, yeah, so it's that kind of thing, except we can't utilize the SHPO and Parks Heritage program the way we do DSL, because they're not staffed up in order to do that. So it's really providing more information, so it's more likely that either impacts are avoided, or if they're not, then a permit is obtained and the operation or excavation or whatever it is done according to the permit requirements that come from SHPO.
Amanda, I hear you on that. I just need to reiterate that the way that this is written right now reads to me like a permit application that may have an impact on an archaeological site will only be approved if avoidance happens.
Right, and that's what I don't. So help me see where that says that, because
so go back up. You've passed it. Go back up.
Yeah.
So what you're saying, when information is entered into the record of decision that the proposed action or development has the potential to impact an archaeological site, the local government must consider appropriate measures as conditions to the land use authorization for characterizing and avoiding alteration to the site. So this says, yeah, you have to know what the site is and you have to avoid it, period. And that's why I think it's important to keep the minimizing in as part of that.
With a permit.
Yeah, with a permit.
You wouldn't do any of this without,
right,
consulting with SHPO, because it'd be a SHPO permit, yeah. So
Yeah.
I think that's why we just need to crosswalk here to SHPO. So I would say the SHPO permits, let us work on this section a little bit. Cause I think we either have too much here or just not quite enough for Jill, sort of like, so either we get more specific here for what local government should do, or remove it and just pump over to the SHPO permit process.
Yeah, I think it needs to get less specific.
Yeah.
Maybe it's here too. So findings on measures considered and measures employed to protect the site by avoiding, and then anything that's other than complete avoiding is where it's likely that a SHPO permit's involved. And so maybe, or.
Yeah, we might lose everything above. Yeah, let's look at it fresh. Can we use can we just put a, I don't know what's bigger than a pin, but can we hold this one over and flip the page to 7, because it gets a little bit, I think, more challenging rather than less. In consideration of landscape areas of cultural interest on page 6, where we have another sort of question for the RAC to help advise us here, if you would. And that will be on 7B. Let a minute finish your thoughts, but on your own personal copies. For land use authorizations subject to quasi-judicial review on rural lands, a local government shall notify the tribes, etc. And then prior to the first evidentiary hearing for a quasi-judicial review, the local government shall offer to arrange a meeting with the tribes and applicant to discuss potential impacts to landscape areas of cultural importance. So 7 is not archaeological sites. These are landscape areas of cultural interest. Thinking about that world now, the later world, looking at that threshold question there in B. And do we want to have the same lack of threshold, basically, and just to say for land use authorization subject to quasi-judicial review and rural lands, full stop. And that's okay for the purposes of this phase of the rule, certainly. We don't need to narrow right now if folks would rather just keep it open.
I would just take out the need to identify thresholds by size and just say quasi judicial reviews on rural lands.
Right. Yeah. Thank you. I mean, it was definitely a struggle to even come up with what we would put in here and Cassie's agreeing with that by thumbs up. It was a struggle here to think of what we would even put in here as different thresholds. So Jill, thank you for the offering. Amanda, does that make sense?
Yeah, I was just holding space for other people to chime in.
Sure. Anyone else? Not seeing any. Okay, sorry, that didn't take that much more time. We could have stayed back in 5 for a while longer. So I'll think Amanda probably got that. There's a couple paths to take in 5B, so we'll have to hammer at that a little bit more and seek the guidance of Gordon Howard internally. Cassie, please.
Yeah, I'm just scanning through this, and I wanted to capture for this group something that came up when we met the other day. I know there are a few people that weren't here the other day that are here today. And something I'm not seeing comments on through here is I still have a concern about the use of the word site in these words. Site has a really kind of specific meaning, and it's even specifically defined up in our definitions, right? And so I want to make sure that we're not confusing people and we're using the appropriate language throughout these areas.
That's something.
It's specific to something here, Cassie, or just generally throughout the whole rule?
Generally throughout the whole rule, but like here it says a city shall, under A, a city shall follow procedures and standards of this rule to determine if the site is significance. You know, within the definitions of this rule, a site, the only place the word site is mentioned is really an archaeological site. An archaeological site is a type of cultural area, but it's not all of the cultural areas. And so I think we talked about either using the word resource or using the word cultural area or something like that, but making sure that we're not confusing people that here we're again talking about archaeological sites.
We use cultural area a lot in ours.
I didn't take the time to pull this up before, but where are you? Still have too many things opened. Here we go. Okay. So the site, again, we're within a rule which is in Division 23, and Division 23 has this whole structure. And so this is the definition, make it a little bit bigger. At the very beginning of Division 23, so 0010 definitions and site.
Okay, so you're saying that site has a larger definition within the goal, not just within this section.
Within Division 23, right, which implements the goal.
Okay.
So it's this here.
Okay. That might be helpful to refer back to under cultural areas.
Yes, and in the rules, the way I remember them is if there's a definition in this part at the very front of the division, then we don't redefine it in the rule.
Yeah, I'm not saying
that's another guidance issue, right? Because that would be a real important thing to explain in guidance.
I'm not saying redefine it. I'm saying reference, like where it says site, a site has that definition as defined in blah, 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 so that people can come back to it. Something like that. So it's clear.
I'm going to stop sharing this and go back to the rule we're working on now. All right. Kirsten?
Yes.
Anything else, or are we?
No, I think those are the key points, you guys, for this portion for today, for at least for us. So thank you for helping us fill in the gaps for the kind of fiscal consultant to come. And obviously we'll be, we have the questionnaire out until the end of day Sunday night. So anytime this week if folks can provide additional comments, those are very welcome through the weekend, and then we'll dive in Monday morning and to develop a clean version for the consultant. Suspect we'll circulate that back out to the RAC just so RAC members know what progress had been made, and then we'll likely publish another version before our July meeting, but this at least would mark the space of, okay, what's going to the consultant for their review for impact.
Can I ask a question before we lose this group?
Of course.
And John, are you still on?
He's there.
Okay. Because I believe that question or that brackets when I put in is it under 5, the archaeological sites and like determining a boundary. I think that came up, maybe it wasn't with a conversation with John, I think it was with Ian, or I was at a meeting with a bunch of people and I was just learning and understanding how this works. And so can this rule just like remove any mention of determining a boundary around a site? Here's my concern is, like, I guess we're mostly talking about a development, and the development's either going to, it'll, once they get their permit and they start, or they don't start, or they do, or they don't get their local permit. So maybe that question of whether a boundary around an archaeological site is determined really just falls into more like characterizing the site and the recommendation that they get to survey the area so there's not a inadvertent disturbance of an archaeological site. So that's so should I just like I've got two places where I say something about figuring out determining a boundary, because to me it seemed like we needed to know about where the limitations were, but maybe that just all comes with characterization of the site and I don't need to say anything about it all in this rule.
Well, I mean, we address boundaries in our permits and our rule, and part of that is related to the National Register, where they like boundaries, and it also helps for future management of an archaeological site if you know both the horizontal and vertical extent of it. So there is an issue with boundaries, especially if, I mean, I was talking earlier about, avoidance may not be, appropriate in certain circumstances, but if it is, how do we know we're avoiding it? And then with all that said, determining the site of an archaeological boundary, especially one with a buried component to it, is difficult. Archaeologists kind of do a few techniques for it, but it's just sort of like a fair effort to provide a little bit of information on that. But if you're still working close to an archaeological site, it's even if the boundary has been figured out by an archaeologist, we would still strongly recommend the inadvertent discovery plan and probably monitoring and things like that. So I don't know if I'm quite answering your question, but I don't have a problem with having a statement in there about determining a boundary, but the way it's worded is fine too, because sometimes you may not, there are instances where land ownership changes and you don't have access to the entirety of an archaeological site. When that happens, our view at SHPO is that it's difficult for us to agree that a site is not eligible to the National Register if we don't even know the full extent of it. So then that makes it a little more complicated, but I do still think that folks could look at what is the known and make a strong case for it being eligible. So, and the boundary can work in that you can get whatever part of the boundary, and then say, and then it extends over, across the fence into, Farmer Bob's, area or whatever it is. So I don't have a problem with it. That was probably too wordy, but
well,
I had too much caffeine today.
Yeah, right now I say something about determining a boundary, so I've got to change that. And then I included this is from the inventory phase for in the standard process. And it says information about location shall include a description or map of the resource area for each site. This doesn't completely apply because we're not mapping archaeological sites. And then it says the information must be sufficient to determine whether a resource exists on a particular site. However, precise location, nah. I think I'm just going to cross this out, and then we're going to have to come back to it, because when we send it for the review for the fiscal analysis, they won't know what to do with this at all. So
that's fair. I think that it's like if somebody fills out what we call an archaeological site form, which is basically saying where the archaeological site is and it describes it, that's how stuff gets on Aura. So every archaeologist who finds an archaeological site should be filling out a site form, and every archaeologist who revisits a site that's already been recorded should update the site. So I don't know if we want language in there for that, but that would be what we would expect if somebody's recording an archaeological site through this process, that it gets a site form is coming to us so that it gets put on Aura so that it's known and can be accounted for.
what if I do this? We'll have to work on this list as Jill says, but because it's the survey that actually gets you to
Cassie has a thought here while you're typing. Cassie, please.
Okay.
No, I appreciate that change down on that list as part of the things to consider. But I guess one of my questions for under 3 is section 3 is information about the state inventory. So I guess what is your goal in providing information about about section E? Are you trying to tell people that site boundaries are not always known? Are you asking the applicant to submit what they know about site boundaries? What are you trying to get at from this section, I guess is
so you said 3. Were we going back up to
Did
section
you mean
3? Or...
Did you mean 5E, Cassie? Right there?
Well, no.
No, okay. Sorry.
When we started this conversation, we were up in section 3, something about the boundary of a significant site.
Okay.
Oh, right. Say something about the boundary, right? This is great. Thank you.
Yeah, so this section is talking about the state inventory. And so for number E that you said, let's delete for this iteration because the fiscal folks won't know what to do with it. But as we're trying to think about what we can provide for you to include as an appropriate language, what were you trying to get at from this?
So I put this in because I heard, which incorrectly, because John corrected me on Thursday, that the Aura database had points, not polygons. But then I learned that sometimes there's polygons and sometimes there's points. But if a site shows up just as a point, then it seemed like it needed to have some area put around it in order for the, or you're like, you have to go within a certain number of feet of the point, right? Well, but the point isn't even exactly where it is. So I don't know. It was just, in our world of land use, we've got maps and we know where things are and all of that, things unfold from there. And in this case, we don't. So I was just trying to figure out if there was some way to blend how archaeological sites are handled with how land use is done, and a boundary made sense, but I don't know. I'm it's the end of the day, and then maybe I'm speaking gibberish right now, but that's where it came from.
It makes sense. I mean, I'm not trying to confuse matters even more, but if somebody's doing just a pedestrian survey and they find an archaeological site, they will record the boundary as what they see on the surface. That's without any effort to excavate and see if there's anything buried further out. So we have a lot of sites like that in our database. We also have points like you said, but we also have polygons where this is just what was visible on the surface. And that can also be based on ground visibility at the time the archaeologist was there, or the time of year, or all these other things. So there's all kinds of factors. So our boundaries for archaeological sites are not like the full extent of the site. Usually it's based on a lot of variables and all of that. Yeah.
And Amanda, I appreciate you putting this in. Sarah has their hand up and I super want to hear from her. I think above all, what we don't want to do in this section is try and redo what SHPO already does. So if we don't need this section, we won't include it. But Sarah, what are you thinking?
Well, I'm sort of actually back to the meeting I had last week with the Forest Service. So there are a couple of ways when you are dealing with people who shouldn't necessarily who are practitioners, who need to do project reviews, who shouldn't necessarily have access to confidential site data. There are a couple of different technical ways that you can buffer that and randomize it enough and still hit the entire polygon, you're going to kind of over concern rather than under concern. And I can have a side conversation with somebody if you're interested in talking about how to spec that out. But I would also note that in a rulemaking exercise like this, I think you want to leave flexibility because you want people to have the ability in either, I mean, smaller local governments aren't going to be building their own tools, but there are a variety of ways to build that out in GIS. That said, there are some things that I think are best practices and that are pretty feasible to do that I have implemented on before. So there are ways to do that successfully that kind of account for the squashiness of archaeological site boundaries in practice, which is, I think, the issue John's speaking to, but also account for your need when you're running an entity where you need to have people who aren't professional archaeologists who still have some idea that they're about to get into a complicated and expensive situation. And so there are ways to handle that. But I think for a rulemaking exercise, you want to keep it at 30,000 feet rather than getting into the weeds. But there are ways that you could spec it at the 30,000 foot level that would allow for the flexibility to develop systems like that. And also, one of the things that I have recently become aware of and that I do want to make sure that we're kind of cautious about during this effort is, at least in Coos County, I guess they've got a site layer, but it hasn't been updated since 2002. And of course, that is, we don't want to write things like that into a rulemaking or a statute or anything like that. We want to essentially cite a continuously updated source rather than say we're going to take today's map. And so that's another thing that I think we need to be very careful about is thinking about how to structure things so that we aren't locking somebody 20 years from now, 25 years from now into a system where they cannot take on all the new knowledge that we have developed over the years. That's a really regrettable situation to find yourself in.
Sure. And just a quick go ahead, Amanda.
I was going to say, Sarah, so the way this is written right now is we point to the SHPO database, which is changing, which, we're still got to kind of figure this out because we're not supposed to point to databases that change. But if we're using that to just inform like an inquiry process, and I get that's all right. But when we're coming, and that's the archaeological sites, when we come to the landscape areas, those right now, the rule as written, those would have to actually be adopted into the local plan, and only if a tribe wanted. So if they didn't want that to be known, then they wouldn't go through this approach. And for archaeological sites, we're trying to keep the information confidential, as only on an as needed basis. But I just wanted to make this distinction that this rule treats the archaeological sites differently than the landscape areas.
No, and I get that, but I think my point is also that there are ways that you can empower staff who are not qualified archaeologists, because I understand the expense and the challenge of getting them to do that. There are ways you can anonymize site locations or buffer out site locations and randomize sufficiently within those buffers that you can actually handle that, and that's a very powerful tool. As long as you make sure that there are continuous updates happening. The other thing is we talk about fiscal impacts. I'm wondering, and forgive me if this has been previously discussed, but when we're talking about the fiscal impacts, and we're talking about asking tribes to engage in large-scale cultural landscape identification studies, has there been any consideration to a legislative ask to support the costs of that for tribes? Because just, I can tell you that's not something that we've got at our fingertips. And when we're talking about the expense of taking on a large scale study like that, it would certainly be facilitated if there were also some resources put toward that.
Sure. So that's a definite, I can't remember what question it is, but it is a question in the survey questionnaire. If you're able to flip through that sometime this week, It's, I can tell you though, it's question, at the end. It's, program development, considering technical assistance to help support a program associated with this rule, what tools will be most needed? Please rank 1 to 5 in order of most importance. And what we don't have called out is we say financial assistance for surveys. So we don't say whether, who that would be for. So that's a choice. Financial assistance for local government to update code and process, model code, webinars, trainings, and informational resources. So, and then it says other, please describe. So please feel free to weigh in on that if you would.
Well, I would certainly hope that tribes would get support that is, since tribes are being asked to develop and provide this information to local governments and to the state, I would certainly hope that tribes would be getting support for that.
Yep.
So I want to make a point there that this rule is not, it's not even really asking tribes to do that. It's providing an avenue through this rule that if a tribe wanted to get a landscape area of cultural significance recognized, they can. There's nothing in here that says they must.
Right,
yet-
but in order
and
to
yet-
invoke the resource protections that are envisioned by the rule,
Exactly.
you're asking the
You're
tribe
right.
to
You're right. You don't get there right without the
considerable
work. But
information, and
yeah.
contributing that information takes staff time and money.
Absolutely,
And so
Sarah.
saying you can have this tool, but you have to pay to use the tool, I would encourage you to consider whether there are ways to find opportunities to support the complete execution of this, because I'll tell you, as we've all learned from the previous decades of Goal 5, when we don't have the resources available to use the tool doesn't get used. And those of us who've been in practice in Oregon for as long as I have, and I think that's most of us in the room, I've been here for 20 years and I have been involved in municipal government implementation on cultural resources at some depth. And I spent 9 years on the Eugene Historic Review Board, and I can tell you that I did not see Goal 5 taken seriously at any point there, again, because those resources weren't there for implementation. And so that's where I'm coming from on this is I think we all need to be really clear about what it's going to take to make this actually make a difference. And I think that's going to mean resources for local governments. And I think it's going to also need to mean resources for tribes.
Sarah, well said. I would say full stop. So that's a good stopping place. We all heard it. You're on the record. So whether or not you get to the questionnaire is another matter. Thank you for saying it out loud. And it's very fair. And we agree. So, this is a new, this whole rulemaking effort proposes a new page for cultural resource identification and protection in Oregon for benefit of all current and future Oregonians. And that will take resources. So thank you. I'd like to see if I could, if Commissioner Thompson has anything in terms of closing remarks. It's been incredibly valuable again for me and Amanda. Obviously we're learning. We could not do this without you. So thank you for being here and making the time, everyone. Commissioner Thompson?
Look, it's the end of the day. Here's what I want to say. Challenging work, good partners, optimistic about outcomes.
Thank you, ma'am. I appreciate. So everyone, please stay tuned. We're going to do our best to get a version off to the consultant, and we'll share that copy with you. We do have this limited. Why are we doing this all so quickly? We have this limited year here to operate before we get into the long legislative session. So that's the promise of our directors to support, and the commission is to support this rulemaking as far as we can get this year. And if there's future phases, there's future phases, but this is the phase we have now. So thank you for being along for this ride, albeit an intense one. So thank you. Best wishes for a good night, everyone, and a good week. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Take care now.
John.